AG Lounge is made possible by Anchor. Anchor is a free creation tool that allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. It will distribute your podcast for you so your podcast can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. You can record with friends or colleagues and edit your podcast right in the app for a seamless podcasting experience. You can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AG Lounge by Airline Geeks podcast. My name is John McDermott, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, Danny Tubertini.
Hello, everyone.
Our first story this week concerns how planes are returned from storage back into service. I'm sure as everyone listening is aware, the coronavirus pandemic has forced a lot of airlines to ground large portions of their fleet. In many cases, grounding a large chunk, grounding a majority, or in some airlines, especially in Europe, even grounding their entire fleet and halting operations for a little while. So this week, we would like to invite our president, Ryan Ewing, who I think last week wrote an article about how airlines will return their planes back into service after storage and all the checks that go on associated with that. Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, everybody.
So we know that a lot of airlines are grounding a good portions of their fleet. So I just wanted to kind of start with kind of the statistics that we know about how many aircraft are being parked and kind of how substantial the amount is. So I know in your article you kind of referenced that a bit, and I kind of wanted to start kind of diving into that.
Sure. So in the June-July time, let me start earlier actually. In the March-April time frame, there were tens of thousands of aircraft, mainline aircraft stored around the world as airlines were sort of shuttering and finding ways to mitigate costs by running empty planes. So they put aircraft in storage. That number in the March, April through May and in June too was holding steady at a very high number of aircraft in storage versus those actually on the line or in service. And then when early July, kind of late June rolled around, that actually number took a major flip. There was actually more aircraft flying on the line than in storage, which was a major milestone. Now, there's a couple cautionary notes there. That the big part of that is Europe and Asia. Obviously, they're a little bit ahead of other nations right now in terms of their handling of the virus. So, Europe has been airlines that have put. I got to think of a way to put this because it'll make more sense. But airlines that have pulled aircraft completely out of service or grounded their entire fleet, when they put their whole fleet back into service or 90% of it, it's going to lead to a big spike. So that's kind of what you have to look at in that data. But a big majority of that is Europe, but US also has a very sizable chunk in that figure too. For example, American has been putting plenty of airplanes back into service. I think a good majority of them are now back into service from how I understood it. And then certainly the airline that I sort of did this article with was JetBlue has originally back in the March-April timeframe had about 74 aircraft sitting at Pinal Air Park, which is located in southern Arizona. And they had, 74, 75 sitting there. And then that number has dwindled dramatically over the past just about a month to about 30 or 40 as they work to put them back onto the back on the line. So, they're capitalizing on the demand that we have here in the U.S., which is domestic travel, because there's no legitimate restrictions on domestic travel here. And there's certainly a market for it. And I think airlines are working to capitalize on that in every way possible.
Your article notes that JetBlue uses an active storage program at Pinal. Is there anything kind of special or unique about how they store that aircraft, or how
There's a different stages of storage. So there's active storage, as they sort of called it, and I kind of put that in quotes because active storage is more of you're running the engines, you're moving the airplane, you're checking it every day almost. So there's a lot of factors and SOPs that go into active storage. Whereas if it's a long-term storage program, that airplane might have its engines pulled. It might be sitting there for months, and there's no shortage of those to it for now. I mean, if you want to, if you ever go down there, you'll see Delta 747s. They look like they've come right off the flight line, but they've been there for several years now, and they're virtually intact. And that's because they're in long-term storage, whether they're waiting for another person to buy or they're waiting for somebody to take the parts, because obviously it's a retired airplane in their fleet, so Delta doesn't really need the parts anymore. So that's a perfect example of that. So there's a difference because those airplanes that they're anticipating, especially the Airbuses for JetBlue that are sitting down there, they're anticipating those will go back into service at some point. And they want to keep them ready to go and be proactive about that, so that when the network ops does need the airplane back into service, it's ready to go. There's no sort of, we have to do this, or we have to work on these service bulletins or whatever.
Your article also kind of dives into the checks, like you mentioned, that need to happen. I assume there's a difference between the checks that have to be done in active storage once the plane's ready to be returned versus long-term storage. But what can you tell us about the checks that happen in general, how thorough they are, what airlines are kind of looking for when they're doing those?
There's pretty thorough checks done. Specifically right before the airplane is put into service. It can be a matter of days from when the airline wants the airplane back and when it does go back. So one of the key ones there is to, move the airplane, ensure the tires are intact, all the basic stuff, brakes, and then lubricate the engines. Because after it's been sitting there, the oil in the engine is certainly going to dry up. It's just like, parking your car for several months, you're going to have the same issue. And then a big part of that is doing a low power engine run where they'll just start the engine, run it at idle. And they do that for a few minutes on I think it's 4 minutes is what the minimum is on that. And then they take the airplane out to the runway, mechanics will, and then run it at a high power engine test, which is about 85% N1, which is pretty close to takeoff power.
I'm also kind of curious to know what role air parks like Pinal play in this. So I know you've spent a fair amount of time there since the pandemic has begun, and I'm kind of interested in how they handled the influx in planes since the pandemic, how they perform checks, what role they play working with airlines to help store planes and bring them back to service.
Right. So on the property there at Pinal, there's a company is called Accent Aviation Services, and they have a location at Tucson International Airport as well. They are definitely the biggest operator on the property there at Pinal, and they sort of house most of the airplanes you see there in pictures. And they have a team of mechanics that works on them and upkeep, and they do demolition of aircraft. They also do active storage programs. Now, the thing about Pinal, it's interesting. It's only a 6,000-foot runway. It's a very small airport. It's smack dab in the middle of the desert. Yet they can handle 747s. They do it all the time, taking off and landing. They have a very key role there. When I went down there in April, it was awe-inspiring because it was just the number of airplanes was incredible. And that's still the case, but to a lesser extent, a lot of them have been returning to service. Delta and JetBlue both have been returning several a day, about 3 or 4 during a weekday on average to service, whereas it was about the third busiest arrival airport in Arizona back in April. There was about 7 or 8 aircraft arriving there back in that time frame.
I'm also a bit curious about how Pinal and Accent both will handle like arriving aircraft versus departing aircraft, and kind of the two waves that we've seen. At like in the spring and maybe March, April, as aircraft were being stored, versus now as they're starting to go back into service. Is there some kind of like way that, well, I'm sure there is like a process for storing them and for maintaining them, and I'm curious how they like kind of scaled up and how they've adjusted for the influx in planes that they've seen.
Well, the dynamic has certainly shifted from when there were 7 or 8 arriving down there a day to 3 or 4 departing. But when an airplane arrives there, typically the process, and I've seen it firsthand, crew gets off. If it's an international flight, which they do get a lot of those, they'll clear customs. Sometimes customs comes there. Sometimes they have to be driven down to Tucson. Air Canada, it's always pre-cleared, so that's a big lifesaver there for them. But they do that, and then they dump the labs, dump the juice, dump the fluids, power down the engine. Then they seal it up with that. It looks like tinfoil. It's not tinfoil, but it looks like tinfoil they put around the engines and critical flight surfaces to ensure, corrosion's mitigated and, just no wildlife gets up in there, which is a problem. And this, like I said, departing is a whole different story. You run the engines, you lubricate the engine, you put fuel in it, there's a whole different process that goes into that.
One question, is there any precaution that needs to be taken by the airline when starting to operate an aircraft that has been in storage for a certain period of time? Because I remember back in the days, back in 2003, when the Concorde had to be grounded because of the Paris accident, and they had to perform a lot of modifications to its fuel tanks. I remember talking to the engineer that actually led the team that did all the modifications, and he told me that the Concorde, while sitting on the ground for a year, about a year and a half, it gained 90 kilos. Like people that stop exercising, when an aircraft stops flying, they tend to put up weight, which is normally it's normally humidity that gets absorbed by the fuselage. Now, of course, in Arizona there is a lot less humidity than there is in London, I can assume, and probably the stop in this case has been a bit shorter. We're talking about a few months. But is there any kind of precaution that needs to be taken from an operation point of view by the airline during the first periods of operation of an aircraft that has been in storage? Because I remember that they said that the Concorde, they actually blocked off 5 seats because of the extra weight. They didn't want to risk going overweight. Is there anything similar?
Well, they said, like you said, it's not a huge factor here in terms of the humidity, but the sealing up the flight surfaces is, like I said, with that tinfoil-looking material, and that's dictated in the aircraft service manual, aircraft maintenance manual, of how to properly do that for the specific type. So there's a whole process there to mitigate any sort of absorption, and then a big part of that is wildlife too. You don't want snakes or birds getting up in the holds and everything. So they do seal that off pretty good.
I think besides the coronavirus pandemic, one of the most applicable ways that we're going to see this kind of return to service happen is with 737 MAX, which many people may have heard is kind of trucking through the recertification process right now in the United States. So of course the process is going to be different a bit for the MAX, since there are going to be have to be a number of software changes and hardware changes to the jet before it can fly to adapt to changes from the FAA. But for a fleet that is as big as the MAX and as unique as the MAX, in terms of situation especially, how do you think we'll kind of see the same things applied? Do you think it's going to be a lot of the same as returning planes to service now? Is there going to be things that are different?
Well, we're already seeing that in a way with the MAX. You'll see them. They have to do engine runs on them. There's a bunch sitting at Pinal. They do engine runs on them almost every couple of days, just to make sure, it's in that active storage phase, because there is a plan to get them back into service at some point. And American ferried a bunch from Roswell to Tulsa the other day. So they're getting them back to the maintenance bases, and they're doing upkeep on them to get them ready for that day. In addition to the other prescribed maintenance procedures that they're putting in place from the FAA and Boeing to update that software.
Ryan, thank you for joining us today. I've enjoyed the conversation. Certainly nice, unique one. And we look forward to having you again in the future.
Thanks, guys.
We are now moving over to Europe, and first specifically to France. A few days ago, the Air France Group, which is a subsidiary of Air France KLM, signed an agreement with its pilot union to restructure the way that it sets up its domestic route network. So right now, for reference, there are three main parts of the Air France Group. So there's Air France, which is the really visible brand that a lot of people know. And then they also have HOP, which is more of a regional subsidiary that it has that operates shorter routes, more local routes to smaller destinations. And then it also has Transavia, which is it's the low-cost arm of the group. So Transavia operates out of Paris Orly, the other two out of Charles de Gaulle. And for quite a while in the agreements that Air France has had with its pilots, Transavia hasn't really been able to fly many, if any, domestic routes, short-haul routes. So it's been focusing more on mid-range and long-range flights. But a few days ago, the two parties, both the union and the airline, came to an agreement that will allow Transavia to take over some of the short-haul flights that Air France and HOP both operate. So Transavia as a brand is really becoming more visible in France. And again, there will be the trade-off of HOP and Air France maybe kind of taking a lesser role domestically in the group. Air France and HOP will both continue to operate out of Charles de Gaulle, I think, or Transavia will continue to operate out of Orly, and they'll kind of expand and warp their operations at the two airports around the specific carriers that are operating there. But I think it is rather notable to see that this is a change that's being made, especially right now during the coronavirus crisis. And I think that there are, of course, reasons for this. Most notably, Transavia is a lower cost carrier. It doesn't have as many big perks as Air France might offer. So like if Air France is flying aircraft that have multiple classes, that have more offerings, that require more crew, that require more supplies, Transavia can kind of help cut down on that, which can help Air France kind of mitigate its costs and reduce its losses during the pandemic by having to pay less crew, to have to pay for less supplies, less maintenance, since the seats might not be as high tech as lie flat business class seats, for example, or wider space, so they have more room for more seats. I think it's another part of it is that as part of the bailout that Air France received from the European Union and from its own government, Air France has agreed to kind of cut down on its domestic flights, mainly to cut its CO2 emissions until it can kind of modernize its fleet, until it can make its fleet more modern and more efficient. And I think this may be a way for the airline to do that without really doing it, since the Air France brand itself will be cutting down on domestic flights, which is fully fulfilling the requirement. But at the same time, it's having another airline that it owns and has a lot of control over and a lot of a stake in, to jump back in and really take over the routes that it's being kind of forced to leave behind by the government.
There's also a factor that needs to be taken into account. The French government that has bailed out Air France during the dog days of the aviation industry, when the pandemic had essentially shut down air transportation almost across the world. The French government pays a lot of money to support the TGV, the high-speed trains that are taking passengers from across France, and they are essentially wanting to encourage the traveling public to use train whenever possible instead of flying. Now, it's not that trains are not successful. However, train is seen as a much greener transportation way of transport, and the government would like to have that that form of transport become more prevalent on shorter trips. Now, this leads to problems like intermodal transportation. How do you get transfer passengers from trains onto aircraft in case they have to fly long haul after having flown a short sector within France? And also, how do you transport passengers from a place where there is no high-speed train to an airport or to a destination when there are high-speed stations? So the reason why they wanted to cut up to 50% is because the government wants to have a ideal situation, where whenever there is a high-speed train, people will take high-speed train and there will be no trains, and planes will be left to operate routes where there is no train counterpart. So now it's actually going to be interesting to see how Air France is going to react to that. When the condition was posed just before the loan was issued, Air France didn't really have a lot of weapons to negotiate. They would probably try to wiggle their way through the conditions and see if they can maintain a network that would allow them a domestic feeding network that could supplement the point-to-point passengers in Paris.
I think it's also kind of interesting to look at how Air France might get passengers from one airport to the other. So if, for example, you're flying Transavia on one of the domestic routes that it took over from Air France, and that flies into Orly, because that's where a lot of Transavia's operations are focused, and then you switch on to like an Air France flight or a hop flight at Charles de Gaulle, connecting through the group. Now, how do you get from one to the other?
Well, realistically, you don't, because a feeding network would need to be based in CDG. I mean, if having done it a couple of times, going from Orly to CDG is not something that you really want to do. You're only going to do it if there's a compelling reason, and that could not be considered a standard solution to transportation problems in France. So, and the only people who are thinking about doing a multi-airport hub are the people in Dubai that are essentially thinking to link the new World Dubai Central that is being built right now. Well, it's already in operation, but it will be expanded to a 120 million passenger airport, to the Dubai International that is currently the base of Emirates. They are planning on building a super high-speed train that goes from one airport to the other in just a few minutes. They are actually thinking about building a hyperloop that could link the two airports in just a few minutes, and that would essentially constitute one unique airport with two, let's call them terminals. But you can do that in Dubai, because you can build a hyperloop in the middle of the desert. You can't do that in the middle of Paris. That is just not is just not realistic. So any feeding network will have to be based in CDG in Charles de Gaulle, and the Orly network will only catered to point-to-point passengers, which would be perfect for that, because Orly is actually very well integrated into Paris local public transportation, and it's actually closer to the center of the city than Charles de Gaulle.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it won't be impossible to make the switch if needed. And if I'm not mistaken, I do believe Air France flies a few mainline flights into Orly. So, of course, I mean, it's not like it's an exclusive one or the other. But yeah, I mean, just kind of looking at the two and how Air France is balancing them right now, and how it will balance them going forward, uh, I think is interesting. I think it's also important to note where Air France stands right now with jobs. Um, as the pandemic hit, it announced, I believe, it's cutting about 7,500 jobs or so. Um, so I'm curious if this agreement might be able to mitigate future losses. I think how it impacts past losses is kind of murky. And of course, this agreement, I think, could impact it if pilots or other crews might be able to go from one to the other. But uh, I think going forward, it's kind of interesting to consider how this will impact future job cuts, if Air France Group needs them at all. Um, so if they'll be able to like strike a deal with unions that will adjust pay rates at Transavia or at Air France based on the reallocation of services, that might be able to extend how long people have jobs for a few months, which could potentially help Air France get through the pandemic better. It could completely eliminate some job losses, if, of course, the airline will be able to better afford to retain crews. But I think that there's a lot of different dynamics with this decision. Just simply looking at how the airline will kind of logistically manage the switch. I think you can also look at kind of where passengers stand with the switch and how the change will impact uh, passenger choice. One factor, of course, being the trains in France, and the French government's agreement with Air France to kind of swap out some air services for train services, at least in the short term. But I think you can also look at cost of flights and how a rise in a lower cost airline can impact fares across France and across Europe as well. So as you know, Transavia flies to more regional destinations, for example, how might their cost structure, their fleet impact how much they're able to charge passengers, and then in turn, how might that impact how other French carriers charge passengers if Transavia flies some maybe short haul international flights? How will that impact how other airlines are forced to charge passengers with the entrance of another low cost carrier into certain markets? And of course, that's already an issue that uh, is present in Europe. Looking at how Ryanair operates, looking how EasyJet operates across the European Union. But I think having one more airline to kind of shake things up, one more carrier that will kind of rise in prominence, and looking at how it'll do that could be an interesting way to see how it'll change the landscape of European aviation. One last story that we have, again out of Europe, comes from the Lufthansa Group, most specifically Austrian Airlines. So Lufthansa Group has a rather interesting, I think, coronavirus testing plan. So I believe the way that the group as a whole does it is that, if there are passengers arriving in Germany, or wherever an airline is based from another country that has a lot of cases or is considered high risk, there will be mandatory tests to make sure that that passengers, aren't carrying the virus, and that in addition to that, if there are passengers flying to or from lower risk countries that have not been impacted as much, there will be voluntary testing so that people will be able to still kind of see if they're sick while they travel if they choose.
Yes, this initiative is being promoted by the CEO of Austrian Airlines, whose name is Alexis von Hirschbruch. I hope I haven't butchered it too much, because my German is close to non-existent. The problem that the airline industry is facing right now, especially in Europe, that relies quite a lot on leisure traffic and relies quite heavily on international transportation, on international traffic, is that there are a lot of limitations on international movements of people between countries. Now, there are what seems to be the most common way to protect local health from foreigners that come in and may actually spread the COVID-19 virus is that these people are required to quarantine for 14 days in a given location and not have any contacts with other people at the place of arrival. Obviously, this is extremely impractical. This kills tourism because nobody has the possibility of going on vacation and spending 14 days in their hotel room or in their apartment or resort before they can do what they've gone there to do. It kills business because no business trip would allow that kind of latitude to have a 14-day quarantine. So, in other words, it limits tremendously the potential traffic for international destination. This comes after a lot of airlines have been asking for different solutions to the problem of limitation to international movements, especially the Association of Airlines, the IATA, has been promoting since the end of June an alternative approach to quarantine. The problem is that the solution they are proposing is not really a solution. It's just a guideline. And they are suggesting to replace quarantine with the application of technology that doesn't really exist yet. They are suggesting quick tests at the airport of arrival that are supposed to replace the quarantine. The purpose of the quarantine is that the COVID-19 virus, the CoV-SARS-2, has been known to have an approximately 14-day incubation period. So if after 14 days of no symptoms, a passenger is still shown as asymptomatic, it can reasonably be assumed that they don't have the virus and therefore they can circulate freely in the society. Now, this is a very strong imposition, and IATA is suggesting that a new multi-layered approach is taken into consideration. However, these suggestions are not really practical. They are essentially suggesting to discourage symptomatic passengers from traveling, and this is it's essentially a PR exercise. The airlines and the governments would need to run campaigns in order to discourage symptomatic people from getting on a plane or start traveling. Put in place health risk mitigation measures, and that is related to the availability of quick tests. Now, quick tests at the moment are being found to be too unreliable to be trusted. I mean, there is a possibly 30 to 40% false negative possibility, and that's just too high to be considered by a government. There are companies that are developing more reliable quick tests, and hopefully we will have them soon available, especially at hospital or long-term facilities where we have seen there are problems with the spread of COVID-19. we don't know how long it will take before this becomes available to airports or airlines. Then there need to be the tracing and tracking mechanism, but this requires a lot of resources that are certainly not within the scope of airlines or airport. They need to be put in place by governments, and some governments have simply decided that it's just too complicated, and it's a lot easier to say, well, you're not coming. It is quite disheartening, especially for us that live very close to the air transportation industry, to see how there doesn't seem to be a lot of energy being put in trying to find a solution. The stop traveling seems to be the easy answer to the question, how do we travel in this pandemic period? But unfortunately, this is destroying an industry. It's virtually devastating tourism. Tourism is an industry that represents the livelihood for dozens of countries around the world, and this is something that the worldwide community should think about. There are some countries, like for example Canada, where I am based, that have decided to adopt a very radical approach. Canada on March 14th put in place a global travel ban and a ban for non-Canadian or non-Canadian resident passengers from coming into Canada. So at the moment, and nobody that isn't a Canadian citizen or a Canadian permanent resident can get into Canada, and this has been the case for over 5 months now. This is a situation that is killing the transatlantic part of the transatlantic traffic. We know that the United States are experiencing problems with the control of the virus, but Canada is managing it quite well, or at least much better than their southern counterpart. And European airlines would like to be able to carry tourists and businessmen to Canada whenever possible. However, due to restrictions put in place by the Canadian government, this is not possible. Senior executives of Air France, KLM, and Lufthansa have written to the Canadian Prime Minister requesting a revision of the travel policy of the global ban for people traveling to Canada. Now, the reason why this is such an important item in the agenda of European carriers is because transatlantic traffic is extremely important for airlines. According to IATA figures that are a few years old, but probably still valid, transatlantic passengers represent approximately 18% of the total number of international passengers worldwide. However, this 18% of passengers delivers 35% of the revenue that is derived from international flights, and 49% of the revenue from premium classes. So almost half of the worldwide revenue in premium classes from international flights comes from transatlantic services. That's why it is so important for airlines both in Europe and in the United States, but especially in Europe, because US carriers can rely on a much larger domestic market to make sure that international services are resumed as soon as possible. What are the solutions? Unfortunately, there isn't a silver bullet that can make this all go away and that can bring the situation back to what it was in March, and probably there won't be for a fairly long time. What is happening in some of the countries that heavily rely on tourism and who simply cannot afford to remain shut down for business for long periods of time, the request for quarantine has been replaced by a request for a negative PCR test that needs to be performed either before departure within a certain time frame, normally it's 48 to 72 hours, or to a PCR test on arrival. Some countries, they've also decided to impose a much shorter quarantine to passengers and to repeat the test at a few days distance, and just to make sure that there isn't a false positive in the first instance. Whenever there are two negative tests after a short quarantine, then the tourists or the arriving passengers is allowed to roam freely at the destination. Now, this solution should be implemented more widely and more systematically. At the moment, there is a patchwork of restrictions that is almost unworkable for anybody who actually doesn't do that as a professional. It's extremely difficult to figure out what the restrictions are and what the requirements are to go from one country to another. Some nations restrict the influx of external passenger based on the country where they've spent the prior 14 days. Some of them, they look at nationalities. It's extremely complicated and it's almost unworkable for international carriers. We, as airline industry, need a much clearer landscape to operate and to plan the complex operations of international air transport. The reliability of quick tests will obviously do miracles for this. It would probably be necessary before things are somehow normalized. And then after quick tests are available, the industry can work on reinstating demand, reinstating confidence in consumers to get on a plane and travel to another destination. Because at the moment, that's also another thing that is missing. Various surveys that have been performed by both IATA and external survey companies show that almost half of the world population is just not comfortable going anywhere at the moment, and that is a massive problem that hopefully will be fixed by science. We're not there yet, and the airline industry needs to figure out how to resist for long enough before confidence can be reinstated.
Yeah, I many kind of executives and analysts of the aviation industry have said that they don't think that really will be back to normal, whatever normal looks like, until there is really a vaccine for the coronavirus. And I think right now having quick, reliable tests is kind of the closest we can come to just saying like we know where the virus is and where it's going and who has it and what we need to do on a specific micro level to prevent the spread. And I think that as we're developing those two things, both a vaccine and a test, we might be able to see some confidence recover. I do think that just having a test, it could be a little harder to restore confidence versus if there's a full vaccine. But in the meantime, we do know that Austrian Airlines has said that it doesn't want to limit people on where they're going and where they're traveling based on overarching general requirements and factors. And while they have said that they will subject people coming from higher risk countries to more testing and to more mandatory testing and tracing, they're also taking some steps to let people travel more and go more places. So like a lot of airlines, they're increasing their network again throughout the next few months, introducing more travel destinations for the winter season, more leisure routes. And it is clear that I think the airline wants to invite people back on board and wants to have people flying again, and doesn't really want to be limited. But I think right now, while testing still is really uncertain, while it is still taking time, it will be hard for airlines to convince people to fly again, especially the people that don't necessarily have to right away.
Yeah, I mean, airlines have always said since the beginning of the pandemic that in terms of demand returning, it would always come in waves. There would be the VFR first, so visiting friends and relations, Then there would be leisure demand, and then the last one to come back would actually be business traffic. The problem is that businesses at the moment, first of all, they are facing a very uncertain economic landscape. Some of them are actually having a tough time. They don't have the same kind of financial performance that they used to have before the pandemic. Therefore, the first place where you normally cut expenses is travel, but also given the uncertainties, businesses need to also be careful about possible liabilities of that they can incur in sending their employees to places where it might not be safe to go. Therefore, the safe decision is to stop all business traffic altogether. Leisure passengers will decide for themselves, and they will probably be more likely to take chances, while businesses would be a lot more careful from this point of view. And that's why we see a lot of airlines restarting flights to leisure destinations. We have seen the announcement from United Airlines that has decided a significant increase in capacity into Florida with more than 20 new routes. We are seeing international carriers starting flights to famous resort destinations rather than to big business cities, and that's because that's where the demand is at the moment.
And I do think when looking at like transatlantic traffic, which is such a big revenue generator for premium classes, I think looking at how the demand returns could also impact how airlines even set up their aircraft in the future. Premium traffic is generally driven a lot by business travelers, many of whom may not be paying for their tickets, and so a company may be paying for them instead, and therefore are better able to fly business class or fly first class than like a leisure traveler who may not be able to afford flying exclusively or flying in premium. So this pandemic, I think, in addition to impacting where airlines fly and how they fly, could impact really how their plans are set up. And I mean, again, looking back to Air France and Transavia, maybe we'll see a greater increase in long-haul, low-cost travel if business travel doesn't come back for quite a while.
Well, this is a possibility. However, we have to bear in mind that premium classes don't necessarily mean business travelers. I mean, business class doesn't necessarily mean a business traveler. There is a fairly large, although not numerically as relevant as as mainstream tourism flow that is oriented towards economy class. There is a fairly significant sector or number of destinations that rely on high-end luxury travel, and this kind of demand may actually be a lot more resilient than the other demand, because obviously those people may have the means to still take vacations, while other people maybe don't have that kind of luxury. And it could be possible that this kind of demand may represent a larger chunk of the premium traffic for some carriers. We in fact see that British Airways, that has a fairly significant, so to speak, network from London Gatwick to the Caribbean islands. And these flights tend to be performed by aircraft with the maximum number of premium seats on them, because that's the kind of traffic that goes to islands such as Cayman Islands or Grand Cayman, Cayman Islands or Antigua or St. Lucia, or places like that. So it's not something that needs to be discarded, because for a short period of time, it could be a significant revenue stream for some airlines.
Thank you for joining us this week on the AG Launch by Airline Geeks podcast. As always, you can read more about all of these topics on our website at AirlineGeeks.com or by visiting our social media channels on both Instagram and Twitter at Airline. Thank you again for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we look forward to spending more time with you again next week.